19. Hands never meant for such delicate work gently pried open the metal carapace of the spider-like automaton. Blunt-tipped nails protected the tips of 3 fingers the color of unbaked bread. The fingers were thick and powerful, better suited to holding a weapon than the thin tool they eased into the tiny gears and mechanisms inside the body of the 6-legged construct. The machine shuddered as if it felt fear. "Be calm," said a voice that was clinical yet held traces of warmth. "You will be improved." The thin metal tool parted a series of metallic wires and exposed the small, glowing core. "Easy, little one," the voice cooed, and the rings spinning around the glowing core slowed and then settled, giving unfettered access to the device that was both heart and brain. The adventurers who had just defeated the 4 Goliaths at the city's entrance would have noticed a similarity to the more massive cores that powered those automatons. While those were the bright red of fresh blood, the surface of this smaller one swam with currents of deep crimson. The 3-fingered hand eased the tool under the glowing core, and, with a low click, it detached from the housing. The hand lifted the core as gently as a heart surgeon and examined it with a set of piercing black eyes. The face was plain but curious. 2 eyes sat in a flat face that had no nose and a thin slit of a mouth. The skin was the same color as the hands, a pale white, almost yellow, that bore no blemishes or variation. A wide grin split the man's face. He was called Erat. He was hairless and his features were bland. He held the core close to his face, and the irises seemed to flick open and close like the lens of a camera. The hand holding the core pulsed with a bright green light. A low hum built up in the man's throat, becoming an oddly melodious refrain as he slowly eased the magical energy into the core. If there had been anyone nearby to observe the delicate procedure, they would have said that he seemed unaware of the hypnotic nature of his song. The dominant red glow of the core resisted the influx of energy for just a moment before drawing it in like a dry sponge sucking up water. The bright green seemed to chase the deep red light, forcing it deeper into the core where it disappeared, leaving the core a shining emerald. A crooked smile crossed Erat's face. It was an uncomfortable grin, as if he had no experience with the facial expression, or, perhaps, like the melodic humming, was unaware what he was doing. He eased the core back into the housing and snapped it back into place. "See, much better." In response, the rings spun around the core once more, moving faster and faster, giving the shimmering core a mirage-like quality. He then snapped the outer armored shell back in place and lifted the mechanical arachnid down to the floor. It flexed and stretched each limb a few times, like a newborn testing its stability. After a moment, it shook, and a whistle came from somewhere underneath its body. "You're welcome," Erat said, his lips parting once more in a quirky smile. "Now, go fix your sister." The construct shuddered, and then walked with precise, timed motions to another one of its kind. This construct was broken and twisted, limbs bent and askew. The altered arachnid walked up and slowly, almost hesitantly, extended one of its forelegs to touch its damaged sibling. A whirring noise rose from within, and emerald light flowed like molten steel down thin grooves set along the length of the spidery leg. The energy flowed into the damaged construct, and the metal morphed as if it were healing. Bent appendages became straight, and wires and joints returned to sockets. The light grew in intensity and would have blinded most mortals, but the man with the black eyes just stared and smiled. Soon the light faded, and the damaged arachnid hopped up and walked towards a small opening in the wall. It entered and disappeared, ready to return to duty. Eret swiveled in the stone bench and patted his leg. The altered arachnid leapt from the ground and landed in the man's lap. Eret scratched its body as if it were a house cat, and the automaton cooed again. The man closed his liquid black eyes and exhaled, satisfied at a job well done. His world felt whole once more. Then everything changed. It started with a low stone-on-stone grating and grew quickly to the rumble of an earthquake. Tools and bits of deconstructed automatons jumped and vibrated on the stone table in front of him. Eret's eyes snapped open, and the deep black swirled inside them like oil. Perhaps unhappy with the exposure to light, the blackness retreated deep into the man's irises. Eret pushed the stone block he'd been using as a chair backwards with incredible ease and placed his hands on the even larger slab of stone that was his work desk, and stood. The vibrations pulsed through his hands, causing his eyes to widen further. "This city is awakening," he said aloud, perhaps to himself, perhaps to one automaton that scuttled near his feet. His tone held notes of anticipation mixed with surprise and a wink of fear. Eret wore no clothes, which made it clear that, in fact, he was not a man at all. Where genitalia would have been on all other bipedal sentient beings, this man had a featureless blank area. His body type was otherwise male. He was tall, packed with lean athletic muscle, and was completely hairless. It was as if an overly modest sculptor had made the perfect male form, bereft of any sexuality. He seemed neither aware nor self-conscious of his nakedness. The chill in the air also didn't seem to bother him at all. He scowled as bits of dislodged dust cascaded from high above, covering his work desk like dusty gray snow. After a few moments, the deep rumble ceased, and the city settled back to silence once more. The man looked down at the automaton he'd been working on. "Let's go say hello." The small machine chirped and followed Eret as he exited the laboratory through a stone archway. He moved down a long hallway illuminated by glowing globes embedded in the walls. Every dozen feet, a small aperture on the wall opened and deposited several of the arachnid automatons onto the floor. They would flex and unfurl their legs and fall in line behind Eret. Several minutes later, a small army of the skittering machines followed in the odd man's silent footsteps. The hundreds of metallic feet of his companions created a wave of metal on stone clacking. After several minutes, they reached a large gallery. The roof was 100 feet or more above the man's head, supported by large buttresses of metal and stone. At the far end of the room, a massive set of gilded doors lay closed, barred by massive bolts and cross braces. Like nearly everything else in the ancient city, the doors were polished and free of grime and dirt. Eret stopped, and the skittering grew quiet. Had he possessed a heart, it would have been pounding like an overworked piston. But he was not, in the strictly biological sense, alive. Like his metal companions, the man was a construct of magic and artifice. Silence hung heavy in the huge room. Each second stretched as the man waited. He knew his world was about to radically change. Then, a metallic clang announced the withdrawal of the large cross braces. The massive black tungsten beams slid from brackets set into the doors with quiet ease into the housings in the walls. Things so large should not be capable of such eerie silence, and the sudden clang of the bolts retracting within the doors echoed like a thunderclap. At his feet, the emerald arachnid twitched, easing a tentative leg out to touch the man on the foot. He looked down and smiled. "Easy. It will be fine." The distant sounds of gears working rose from somewhere behind the walls, and the doors opened. Conflicting feelings of fear and excitement built in the man. Apart from his metal friends, Eret had been alone for longer than he could remember. Distant memories of his father called from the corners of his mind. Have father's people returned? The doors opened and settled into alcoves in the walls. Dim light poured into the room from a dozen glow globes, backlighting 5 figures. Their long shadows crept across the floor, questing towards the man. Without realizing it, his mind reached out, and the arachnids moved into the room. The combination of light, cloak, and mask obscured the newcomers' features as they fanned out into defensive positions. "Make way for the Master of Dar Thorim!" A tall, lithe figure shouted and brought the butt of a spear crashing down onto the stone floor with a snapping thud. The voice was deep, and it reminded Eret of his father. "Hello," Eret said, raising a 3-fingered hand in a cheery, if stiff, wave. An arachnid moved towards the nearest cloaked form. It was a short and stocky figure, clutching a heavy 2-handed hammer in its thick-fingered hands. The automaton reached a tentative limb out towards the figure, but a violent burst of motion brought the hammer down on the arachnid, crushing it with ease. Eret heard a voice yell in pain and anger and realized the sound had come from him. Blazing coronas of blue light formed mystical shields around the arachnids, and the swarm surged forward. The hooded figures unleashed the power of magic and weapons. Despite their defensive shields, a dozen of the automatons fell in the first few moments. Hammer blows crushed some. Others were sliced by the whirring blade of a sword. Still others were pierced by spear tip and arrow. However, it was the flares of magic that did the most damage. Electrical surges erupted from fingers of one of the hooded figures and thrummed into the nearest arachnid's shield. After a few seconds, the shield blinked and failed, and the lightning slammed into the automaton's carapace. It shook and lost control of its body. Deep inside the armored shell, the electricity surged, charring the machine's dynamo core. An overload tore through it, and the core exploded, shredding the arachnid's body from the inside. The white-blue bolt erupted from the destroyed machine, split, and pummeled the shields of 2 more of the automatons. Soon their shields failed as well, and the cycle continued, 2 becoming 4. Eret felt every one of the arachnids as their existence blinked out. Each one caused a jarring bolt of pain to flash through his mind. Before he knew what he was doing, Eret had leapt into the air, the artificial muscle in his legs sending him higher and farther than any normal mortal. He brought a knee down onto the nearest of the attackers, the stocky one with the hammer. Edit heard a dull snap as something inside the cloaked figure's body snapped, and the man grunted in anguish and fell to one knee. Edit had no weapon, but he brought a fist downward into the man's silver-masked face. A small crack appeared in the mask, and the man grunted in further pain, one hand reaching behind him to prevent him from falling onto his back. His other hand gripped the hammer, and Edit saw a ring on the man's finger flare with golden light. The light twined up the man's arm like a coiling serpent, bringing healing magic to his body. The man sighed in relief. The stocky man smashed upwards with the head of his hammer, and a word of power snapped from him. The blow took Edit in the chest, and a thrum of force slammed up and into him. Edit flew backwards and hit the wall with a thwack. He slid to the floor and fell hard. His vision blinked red. The single strike delivered a major blow, and his health hovered a hair over 70%. Shaking his head to clear his vision, Edit saw the stocky man charging him. The hammer came down in an arc, and Edit stepped aside, grabbing the weapon's haft, and spun. He lifted the warrior full off his feet and tossed him towards his companion, who was still pouring electrical current into the ever-branching root system of deadly lightning. The hammer wielder's body smashed into the caster, and the lightning ceased. With a mental command, Edit pulled the swarm of arachnids back. He'd felt the loss of nearly 24, each one a tiny stab of pain in his mind. He could not, would not lose more of his friends. The swarm lined up, shields flaring into a defensive wall, and Edit backed from the room. Rage surged inside him, an emotion he had no experience with, and he felt tears flow down his face.
"I just wanted to be friends,"
he yelled, and he heard a sinister chuckle as another volley of electrical power slammed against the shield wall. Edit backed out of the room and ordered the swarm to scatter into a dozen of the small holes. The invaders were too large to follow his friends, and he hoped they would be safe. The cloaked figures advanced with an even pace, showing no concern over the departed arachnids. Edit turned a corner and placed his hand onto a section of wall indistinguishable from the rest. A small rectangle of stone pushed inward, and a section of the wall raised upwards with a near-silent swoosh. Edit stepped into the darkness and slapped his hand against the inside of the wall. The door closed just as silently, and a moment later, peering through a small peephole, Edit saw the invaders walk past. The hammer-wielding one paused for a moment, staring towards the wall that hid Edit. The silver visage glared at the wall without expression, and Edit eased tendrils of his thoughts through the ether. They twined invisibly around the mask and into the mind behind it. It felt wrong, stained, malicious. Edit wanted to pull out, but did not. He saw a dim light in the mind's depths and went deeper, pushing through a thick haze of solid fog. As he emerged into the glowing interior, his mind exploded with despair and pain.
"Help me!"
Edit pulled back in shock and confusion, and he saw the dwarf flinch and shake his head. He stood straight and turned back as one of his fellows barked a command at him.
"I'm coming,"
the dwarf said, and with one last glance at the wall, he followed the others.